we then move on to the actions that are needed now,
Yeah.
this thing keeps reoccurring in lots of ways, and I'm pleased about the debate. But we know the history of Jim Crow and lynchings, and we know the marvelous hopefulness that was brought by the civil rights movement. We now see, though, new iterations. There's an endless creativity in how do you re-enslave black folk and other folks of color and people who are poor. We've got something which I now call the cradle to prison pipeline. And we've got to address, as we address the individual actions that we all need to take, we need to address the policies and the systems that reinstitute. We still have separate but unequal education in this country for the majority of our children, and we need to address that. And illiteracy was a major problem. We know about poverty. We have children are the poorest group of Americans. It's a disgrace that we let our youngest be our poorest age group, and they're disproportionately poor, and that 80% almost of our black children cannot read at grade level in 4th and 8th grade and drop out of school at extraordinary numbers. What is a child going to do in this globalizing competitive world? They can't read or compute at the most basic levels. It's slavery. It's prison. We need to speak up, and we need to understand what is happening here. The assault on voting rights, the assault on voting rights and the corruption of the political process by money. I mean, wake up. Wake up.
Well, how do you respond to people who say, slavery was so yesterday, get over it, you people been free since 1865, what about my ancestors that came here for nothing? How do you respond to that?
I respond to that by looking again at the data and looking at the reality. And the fact that we have to deal with issues of structural racism. The reality of what's embedded not only still in law, but also in consequence in culture in American society are directly related to the consequence of slavery and this idea of supremacy and the fact that people and white men, and you look back to the data, you look back to the writings of that day, and in fact, everything that slavery was predicated on was the fact that white men said, we are better than black people. That allows us to enslave black people, and that sensibility still lives and is woven into the fabric of our culture. And you see it because of the reiteration of slavery into Jim Crow, into the mass incarceration of people of color. And you see it in so many other places as we deal with issues of voting, of our workforce, and other forms of law and culture that exist for us today. And I mentioned structural racism for a very specific reason, because that lives and breathes today in our society. It has created an architecture around which much of our society has been built, and even though laws have been passed, there are still customs, there are still folkways, and in fact, there are still ways that we see manifested. You just look at mass incarceration, something that we talked about earlier this morning, that we see its implications. At the same time, and I think when you read Michelle Alexander's great book about mass incarceration, we see this.
The New Jim Crow.
The New Jim Crow, that she talks about ways in which poor whites and poor blacks over the course of history have had aligned issues, but race has been used as the wedge to divide and to keep them apart, and from advocating together for a way forward. Race cannot be ignored. Again, it is part of the founding, part of the DNA, and we still live with its ramifications.
Great, thank you.